This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. Ahead of us on this Wednesday program, we have K-State Associate Professor and Researcher in the Division of Biology. Alice Boyle gives insight on her and Walter Dobbs' latest research study, looking at utilizing virtual fence lines as a way to manage both cattle and potentially conserve the tallgrass prairie. Also ahead, Todd Barrows, Chief Farm Program Specialist with the Kansas Farm Service Agency, covers what producers need to know about the Crop Disaster Assistance Program, an emergency relief program to help with production losses suffered during the 2020 and 2021 calendar year. On the first of this week's horticulture segments, K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent Dennis Patton covers compost in the first of this two-part series this week. He says it's both a science and an art. That and more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. Today we have a unique research highlight coming from the K-State Division of Biology. To speak about this research, I have in studio with me today Dr. Alice Boyle, an associate professor and researcher on this study, who is also working with Dr. Walter Dobbs. So today, Alice will be sharing with us about their research, which centers around the use of virtual fencing to manage livestock. So Alice, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. You guys are using some high-tech collars in terms of managing livestock.
Yeah, these are GPS controlled collars. Each female cow has one of these on her. And what the collars allow us to do is not only know where the animals are, but also you can program in a virtual fence line, an electronic sort of signal. And when the cattle approach that fence line, the collars make a noise. And with experience, the cattle learn to not pass that noise. But if they go a little bit further, then they receive a mild electric shock that hopefully deters them from going past that.
This is year one of a 5-year study that you guys have going on. So tell us what year one of the study will look like.
Year one is getting the cattle used to the collars and then doing a lot of pre-treatment sampling. So there are multiple players in this project and a lot of different sort of aims and goals. And from the biology side of things, we're interested in using this technology to manage on very small scales sort of vegetation structure and also where cattle can access water, and in hopes of managing stream water quality, invertebrates that live in those streams, and the vegetation structure is suitable for protecting some of our most endangered wildlife. And so this year, we're collecting information on where the cattle go. We're collecting information on what those areas look like, what the stream water quality is like in a normal year, if there is such a thing in Kansas. And then in subsequent years, we'll apply these sort of boundaries and measure sort of the response of the vegetation and the birds and the water to those virtual fences.
Looking at 3 different locations for this study, is that correct?
Well, actually 2 adjoining properties. So the southern end of the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve and the adjoining private ranch owned by the Mushrush family.
What was that partnership like with that family in terms of utilizing their land for this project?
So far, it's been just amazing. The family's been wonderful working with us. We've done our best to partner with them in the design of the study so that it meets their goals as well, because major objective is to come up with conservation solutions that also improve the ranching economy. And as a bird biologist and somebody who's interested in the Great Plains generally and grasslands generally, I know that grassland conservation is only going to happen through cooperation with private landowners. And so the only way for us to make this successful, preserve any grasslands in decades to come, is for us to find ways to do that while being profitable for ranchers.
Sure, and you just hinted at this in what you just said, but the importance of producers maintaining their land is, of course, something of the utmost importance to them as well for generations to come.
Absolutely.
So this study is really getting at the forefront of that. You're looking at protecting waterways, but also local species of these, native grasslands as well. So.
Exactly. Yeah.
So at the forefront of the research, what are some major goals that you guys are hoping to achieve?
Well, I would say that the different players have different goals. And so from the division of biology perspective, from my perspective, I'm really interested in ways to manage the landscape in such a way to keep some of our most threatened prairie-dependent bird species on the land. Those include greater prairie chicken and Henslow's sparrow, and then also include some of the more common but really seriously declining grassland-dependent birds like eastern meadowlarks, grasshopper sparrows, things that need these landscapes that we have here. My colleague Walter Dobbs, who's also involved in this project, is interested in the water quality aspect of it. And then our partners at Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, the Nature Conservancy, they're interested in managing things like heavily degraded areas along fence lines, for instance. Can we use this just to sort of boost populations of plants in areas that have become really degraded through trampling? And the mushrushes actually are really interested in that as well, because in places where cattle funnel through particular areas, they've lost vegetation in those areas. They're losing grazing lands, and that affects the water quality as well, of course.
You know, the onset of rains in this area that we've had in this part of Kansas doesn't help with that sort of
No,
thing.
it doesn't.
It makes it difficult for these cattle to get through those areas, too, as well. So I know that's of utmost importance for producers.
Sure.
So tell me a little bit about the grant that you guys are working under for this project.
Well, it's funding that came through the Nature Conservancy, and so at a national level, there were 3 areas where virtual fence technology is where there are virtual fence projects. And these are sort of pilot areas where they're testing the efficacy of this technology, and if it works, then it'll become something that they hope to scale out more. And so my understanding is that the different Nature Conservancy regions sort of put together a grant application, and I helped in writing that, and the Kansas proposal was one of the ones chosen for that. And so the money is coming through K-State for the research having to do with the streams and the birds and the vegetation monitoring and all the field sampling that we're doing. But the Nature Conservancy was the one that secured the money for that.
Let's talk a little bit more about these GPS tools that you guys are using. Mm-hmm. It's incredible technology, one, but it's also, in long terms, I guess, more affordable than maybe traditional fencing methods. That's
what we think, yeah. I think it's never going to replace exterior fences, but it could save thousands of dollars. I don't know how much more annually in interior fencing, certainly. I mean, one of the nice things about it is this. Not only could it replace some sort of more permanent fencing, but it provides a mechanism to move cattle more dynamically around pastures into different areas. And so you can actually set up a line, get them used to it, and then push that line in a certain direction and push them into areas that, say, a slope that they aren't utilizing to the degree that you'd want. So it might improve the efficiency of the land use as well.
Might even be beneficial in terms of rotational grazing that
exactly.
Some of these producers utilize as well.
Exactly.
So, but really, I guess over time, the idea is that it's less labor intensive for sure. So in terms of how they work, you mentioned that it uses audio and then some electric shock. What has it been like watching the cattle you've been utilizing so far?
So like I think I mentioned at the beginning, this is year 1, and right now the cattle are wearing the collars, but the collars aren't telling them to go anywhere. Gotcha. So we haven't seen how they react to the the mild electric shock. This is technology that is being used elsewhere, but as I understand it, there will likely be a small percentage of cattle that ignore those signals, and that's to be expected. And so it's not. That's why I say it's not ever probably going to replace an exterior fence line, because you don't want those 5% of animals getting out onto the highway or something.
The information that you guys gather from these studies, where can producers look to find that, hopefully, in the future?
We hope to disseminate this in many different ways. And one of the ways is that we're having a field day down at the Mushrush Ranch just in a couple weeks. I think it's the 23rd or 4th of June. And it's an opportunity for people to come and see what we're doing, see the collars, talk to, various people involved in the project. And so that's one way of doing it. We'll continue to do field days throughout the project each year. we will produce some leaflets or pamphlet materials suitable for anybody, popular consumption, reporting on the results of our study. I'm very keen on making sure this reaches as many people as possible. I think the infrastructure set up through the Nature Conservancy also definitely ensures that this will be disseminated broadly. So there are biologists working with private landowners through the Flint Hills and elsewhere in Kansas. If this is successful, if this is something we think is both good for conservation and landowners, then you can be sure that they will be talking to individual producers.
So hopefully some major outreach to come in terms of how this project goes later on. Alice, is there anything else that you'd like to mention?
I want to say that my experience so far, I've been in Kansas for 10 years, and I have met some of the most impassioned conservationists in the state are the ranchers who own these lands and are interested in the welfare of not only their own enterprise, but the whole ecosystem. And so the reason why I'm so excited about this project is that it potentially offers a true win-win for both the wildlife that I care about and also the people. And those are the only kinds of solutions that are going to work long term.
Alice, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. We're all looking forward to seeing the results of your study here to come. Some additional information on that fast approaching field day that Alice just talked about. The Tallgrass Legacy Alliance is hosting the field day on June 23rd. At the Mush Rush Sale Barn, which is located near Elmdale in Chase County, Kansas. You can RSVP for the event with Roger Wells. His email is rnwells@fairpoint.net. That was Dr. Alice Boyle, Associate Professor and Researcher from the Division of Biology here at K-State. More ahead on Agriculture Today. We are now back with more from Agriculture Today. For this week's Farm Service Agency segment, we have with us now Todd Barrows. He is the Chief Farm Program Specialist with the Kansas Farm Service Agency. Todd is here to discuss with us the latest program on crop disaster assistance, which is an emergency relief program made available to producers that encompasses production losses that were suffered as a result of weather events that you all might have experienced during the 2020 and 2021 calendar year. Todd, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Absolutely, Samantha. It's great to be back, and it's always good to stop in and sit down and discuss what's going on in agriculture in the Midwest and across the state of Kansas. And today, the most prevalent thing that we're doing at FSA is we're right in the midst of an application process for the recently announced Emergency Relief Program. And this came about through the Extending Government Funding and Delivering Emergency Assistance Act that was passed in September of 2021. Congress allocated $10 billion for this program. And it is geared towards assistance to agriculture and producers impacted by wildfires, droughts, winter storms, floods, derechos, excessive heat, excessive moisture, and freeze, to name some of the causes that would be applicable to the Midwest and Kansas. There's others, but they would not be applicable to our state. The program will be implemented in two-phase process, and currently we're in the implementation of Phase 1, which kicked off on May the 21st. And in that kickoff, we mailed out 21,000, just a little over 21,000 pre-filled applications to primary policyholders that had federal crop multi-peril insurance. And that's in Kansas, the second largest number in the nation. An additional 5,000 applications will be issued later, and that will go out to those producers that have the Non-Insured Assistance Program, or commonly referred to as NAP, with FSA, as well as producers that have supplemental coverage through federal crop insurance or enhanced coverage, margin protection plans, or area risk coverage. Those are coming shortly under Phase 1, but they just required a little bit more details before we could get the letters and the information out on those. Again, as I mentioned, Phase 1, just to clarify, does include all primary policyholders that received an indemnity payment for crop production losses due to a loss event in calendar years 2020 and 2021.
So you just mentioned those over 21,000 pre-filled applications. Does this mean that the producer, can you speak more on that? Does this mean that the producer is eligible for disaster assistance?
And that's a great question, Samantha, and we've been getting that a lot in our field offices and service centers across the state. And I want to be very clear to this point. Just because they received a pre-filled application under Phase 1, it does not mean you're automatically eligible. Again, those producers that received the pre-filled applications, all that means is that they were a primary policyholder and received an indemnity. But producers still must certify that they incurred a loss due in whole or in part caused by one of the qualifying disaster events. And I mentioned those earlier, and also I'll mention later on where those can be looked up on the web, or they can always go and ask their local service center for further details on that.
So if producers do believe they are eligible, can you explain how they can complete those pre-filled applications?
Absolutely. It's really a pretty simple process. Remember, every primary policyholder received the pre-filled application. So on the application, there's three things that they need to ask for, or there's questions that they need to fill in. The first one has to deal around with share. And when it's talking about the share on the pre-filled application, what it's really asking is, in the context of who shared in the crop insurance indemnity payment, which is listed on the pre-filled data element. So if you're a primary policyholder, you received 100% of the indemnity that's listed on the application, then you'll receive 100% of this share. The second question that they need to agree to in completing the application is producers must agree to purchase crop protection coverage through either federal crop insurance or NAP as applicable per crop at a minimum of 60/100 coverage for the next two available crop years. And I really wouldn't think that'd be a big hurdle since these producers that got these applications have already has insurance coverage. Mm-hmm. And then the last thing is, and probably the main question is, it's a yes or no question, and producers just have to certify that they did, in fact, experience a qualifying disaster event, whole or in part, that caused a portion of their production loss.
If producers, as they're reviewing this information in this pre-filled application, if they believe one or more of these data points that you're talking about are wrong, what action should they be taking?
Another great question, and we've been hearing this one more than what we thought we would or see, but just as a reminder, under the Phase 1, there is no correction or editing process of those pre-filled applications. So if the producer has a couple things that they can do, they can either accept the application as it is, or they can discuss those data elements that may be wrong or in question with their insurance provider. And if a correction needs to be made, those can be made, and then they will be handled through the Phase 2 process of this program, which will probably come out sometime this fall.
Speaking of that Phase 2 program, what can you share about it under the ERP?
Well, and not a whole lot, but I do want to bring out that, the encompass of Phase 2 will be for those producers that experienced eligible loss, again, by a qualifying disaster event that did not receive a payment under Phase 1. A couple of things that will include will be, we call them shallow losses, or when producers had a loss in production but it didn't trigger an indemnity payment, or those producers that had uninsured crops, and then finally also producers that suffered a quality loss but not necessarily a production loss.
Okay, and then in terms of some special considerations for underserved producers, what are some of those considerations regarding payment provisions?
Yeah, that's correct. There are some special provisions under the payment process for those, we call them HUP, or historically underserved producers, and those producers will receive an increase of 15% to their calculated emergency relief program payment. Those groups include your socially disadvantaged farmer or rancher, which does include gender as one of the qualifiers under that category, as well as race. Also, we have limited resource farmer or rancher, beginning farmer or rancher, and then, of course, the veteran farmer or rancher. And I just want to put out some clarification on that one, because we have been getting some questions. If you are a veteran, it does require you to be within 10 years of your discharge date and that you have not owned or operated a farm for more than 10 years. Additionally, I want to mention, too, all Phase 1 payments will have a payment factor of 75% applied due to the availability of funding, just to make sure we don't run out. And in other words, what that means when you have a 75% factor applied, for example, a $1,000 emergency relief program payment will net the producer $750.
Good to know. Good to know. So in terms of questions you've been getting from producers, what are some of those common questions?
The biggest questions from producers is, how do I know if I have a qualifying loss? And our response that we can talk about on that is, just a question back. Did you suffer a production loss is the main thing. And then second of all, if you did suffer a production loss, then can you say it was in whole or in part of one of these qualifying causes or disaster conditions such as drought, excessive heat, excessive moisture, flood, etc. And if so, you are eligible. And we talked about those at the beginning, and those are also listed on the application in itself. So they're there for your review. The other question we're hearing a lot is, what will I have to provide to show that I have a qualifying event if spot checked at a later date? And the best answer that we have at this time is just, if you're a producer, just to make sure that you are gathering weather data, and that could be from any type of weather source, media articles, or any crop insurance data that would support your claim and which you're certifying to as your causal loss. And again, that causal loss is just a yes or no question. And then to wrap that up, one more thing I do want to throw out, or I should throw out, just as a reminder, these are for production losses, so grazing crops are not included in the ERP program.
Well, these are all good things to know, especially in the times that we're currently living in with major weather events or lack thereof going on. So, Todd, thank you so much for explaining some of these tools for producers to know about, for sharing the important programs that are designed to help alleviate some of these financial pressures as a result.
Yeah, absolutely, Samantha. It's like I said, it's always great to stop by and take a minute and visit with you all. And I just want to put out there, one last time, producers have specific questions with their own operations, and in those cases, it's best if they can't find the answers online at the farmers.gov that they just contact and reach out to our local service centers in their area or location, and we're more than happy to help them and guide them through that process. So, again, appreciate working with you and our friends and ag partners, and thanks for having us today.
Absolutely. That was Todd Barrows, Chief Farm Program Specialist with the Kansas Farm Service Agency. We'll be back with more on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. Compost is the ultimate soil amendment. In fact, it's often called black gold because of its value in improving soil quality. But how do you create a good compost pile? In the first of a two-part series this week on composting, K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Johnson County, Dennis Patton, says that it's both a science and an art.
By textbook definition, compost is nothing more than decayed organic matter. So going through the process of composting, this plant matter, debris breaks down. It could be animal matter, too, anything organic. And basically what we get then is a finished product we call compost or humus or organic matter. And it's that material that we want because it's probably the best product to use to help break up our Kansas clays.
And I guess really we kind of think of just throwing everything together, but there really is kind of a chemistry and a science to composting?
Right. When I work with people on composting, I kind of say it's an art and a science. The science is making sure the composting process works, and I think the art part of it is figuring out what works for you. It's a two-step thing, but really it's nothing more than managing microorganisms that feed on the organic matter, and in their process of feeding, break it down and turn it into compost. And I think the aha moment for me and when I train other people on composting is we put dead stuff in the compost pile but the compost pile is actually very much alive. And it's managing those microorganisms that helps the compost process take place.
And really because of that, we want to make sure that we pick the right location for the compost pile?
Right. There's really not a bad location. There's probably just more of a desirable location. So, kind of looking at location, there's pros and cons of being in the sun versus the shade. Being in the sun, it probably is going to be active longer into the fall and heat up quicker in the spring. Being in the shade, though, decreases some of the desiccation, drying out of materials during the hot part of summer. So I think either place works. Probably the place you want to avoid is a low area that's going to collect water, those type of things, because too much water then takes the oxygen out of the compost pile, turns it into an anaerobic situation, which can lead to an odor or a smell. Most people want to locate it kind of out of sight. It's not something you want to stand at your kitchen window and stare at the compost pile, but I think it kind of depends on your property. So there are some rules, guidelines, but nothing really hard and fast.
You mentioned that this is organic material, but what comprises a good compost pile?
Right. For most homeowners, what we're really talking about is plant debris. So what we're really talking about is waste material from our gardens, whether that be vegetable garden, flower gardens. Could also be kitchen scraps, any of the food products that do not have fats and oils. So a good example is if you're peeling carrots, making a salad, all those could go into the compost pile. But once you put dressing on it, you got that oil, that fat on it, that probably needs to be discarded, not composted. And the other probably main ingredient is going to be those people that have to rake their leaves in the fall. We have fallen leaves. And those people that potentially catch their grass clippings would be the other main source of composting material for the average kind of homeowner.
Other than the oil-based, is there anything else that we maybe don't want to be putting into the compost pile?
Yeah, so things we kind of avoid composting when it comes to food waste is anything with fats and oils, meats, those type of things, because they're more likely to draw rodents and other less desirable critters to the compost pile. As a rule of thumb, we want to be really careful composting animal feces, especially our pets like cats and dogs, because there are potentials in disease transmission. But, if you've got a source of cattle, horse manure, those type of things, that actually can be good to add to the compost pile, because we haven't really touched on yet is what we call the greens and the browns, or the nitrogen sources versus the carbon sources, which is really then where the science/art of composting comes into play.
That's K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Johnson County, Dennis Patton. Tomorrow, Dennis covers the proper mix of greens and browns for a good compost pile. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.